School dinners are the meal that we all love to hate. For people in Britain, they've been the butt of jokes for decades. But there's a big difference between laughing at a school lunch and being forced to swallow the shocking truths about it head on. In 2005, celebrity chef Jamie Oliver hit headlines with a damning expose of the school meals system. He found that a scheme brought in to help children had been systematically failing them for years. As childhood health plummeted and obesity soared, the finger of blame turned to schools. Outraged parents demanded answers. Investigations found that budget cuts, catering contracts, and so-called changes in modern appetites had all led to a massive drop in food standards. But how was this allowed to happen? And with stories still bubbling up in the press, are school dinners really any better now? But first, let's get back to the start of this story. See, school dinners have been part of British society since the early 1900s. In 1906, the Provision of Meals Act gave local education authorities the right to serve meals. This was often a simple school breakfast, something like porridge or bread and dripping. Definitely a dish that was of its time. If you were poor, these might be free or subsidised, and if you weren't, you'd probably be asked to pay. It was all optional, so despite this, some local authorities chose not to join in with the scheme at all. By the 1940s, though, the government was putting its weight behind the importance of a square meal, and so in 1944, a new act ruled that local authorities had to provide milk, meals, and other refreshments for pupils. These didn't have to be free, but they did have to meet certain nutritional standards. Your typical school dinner at this time might be tinned meat like spam fritters, served with vegetables and potatoes, followed by something like rice pudding. Wartime rationing was still in place, so it was hard to get fresh meat, but because meals were prepared and cooked in the school kitchens, things could be more flexible. If a school managed to get its hands on some fresh local ingredients, it could use them. Overall, quality was decent for its time. There might not be dishes that we'd choose to eat nowadays, but through the 1950s and 60s, children were being fed relatively well. Then came the Thatcher era. In 1971, Margaret Thatcher ended the provision of free milk for primary school children, saving the country a few quid and earning her the nickname Thatcher Milk Snatcher. Almost a decade later, in 1980, her government swept away those pesky nutritional standards. Now, there was no minimum quality to meat, granting free rein to whoever happened to be in the kitchen, and actually, local education authorities no longer had to provide the meals at all, if they didn't want to. School catering could be outsourced to private contractors who'd compete to drive down prices. Of course, standards plummeted. With the new ethos of cheap equals good, an abundance of frozen, fast foods and sugar-rich desserts piled onto the school menu. Your 1980s selection might contain options like sausage rolls, pizza slices, chips, and chocolate crunch with custard. By the 1990s, a medical study proved that post-war children were actually healthier than their modern counterparts, despite navigating food rationing. For 90s kids, dietary levels of fibre, iron, calcium, and vitamins were lower. It would also come out that they'd been fed meat contaminated with BSE, but here on Scandal, that's another story. Literally, by the way, and you might like to check it out after this one. Anyway, at the time, senior paediatricians and dietitians were warning of the slippery slope that children were on. And so, in 2001, regulations were brought back in. Once again, there were some standards that school dinners had to meet, and it was the standards that schools would later be critiqued against. In 2003, the Soil Association published its Food for Life report into school meals, and it argued that profit was the driving force in feeding the nation's children. Despite some attempt to improve things, the government simply hadn't done enough to promote standards. Healthy eating was being taught in classrooms, but in school halls and cafeterias, that message hadn't filtered through. The report also made some shocking claims. After analysing menus from a number of local authority schools, the Soil Association calculated that each meal could be whipped up for as little as 35 pence. Where the service was outsourced to a private company, the figure could drop to as little as 31 pence. In contrast, food worth around double that figure, 60 pence, was being served to prisoners in English jails. Criminals were eating better than children. It was a whopping headline, but didn't make much of a difference. In Scotland, though, healthy eating standards in schools were much higher. A £63.5 million campaign, Hungry for Success, had led to a purge on salt, fat and sugar in school meals. Processed meats could only be served once a week, with alternatives like oily fish being upped. Daily food options included brown bread and 2 helpings of both fruit and vegetables. In stark opposition to this, English rules were more relaxed. There were regulations around how many times a week red meat and fish should be served, but what they didn't dictate was the quality of this meat and fish, or its salt and fat levels, or the minimum amount of actual meat and fish that should be in it. By this, of course, I'm referring to products like the notorious and desperately nostalgic Turkey Twizzler, which contained only 34% turkey. So in sum, it was all pretty dire. In 2004, nutritionist Helen Crawley said that many schools provided mediocre food, and in some cases the food is absolutely desperate. There was talk of an obesity crisis. Official data showed that between 1995 and 2005, the percentage of overweight or obese children aged between 2 and 10 steadily rose from almost 23% to 31%. Fewer than 1 in 5 children were eating the recommended 5 a day. Organisations and charities were crying out for change, but what would really tip the scales was public pressure. Enter Jamie Oliver. Back in 1999, a new TV show called The Naked Chef had first aired on BBC. Despite any hopes that might have been raised by its name, this did not feature Jamie Oliver dressed in nothing but an apron and a smile, although amongst a certain demographic, I'm sure that would have been very popular. The naked bit actually just applied to his food. Oliver's whole brand was built around simple, no-frills cookery and real ingredients. So in his way, he was actually the natural candidate to tackle the topic of school meals. In 2005, Channel 4 aired Jamie's School Dinners, a 4-part documentary in which Oliver went into British schools, argued with dinner ladies, and sparked rebellions by banning chips. Apparently, children aren't more likely to eat their green just because they've been made by that chef off the telly. But obviously there was a more serious point here, despite all the kind of TV debacle. The show set out to pick at the loose threads of school dinners, and it did it well. Jamie Oliver highlighted the worrying extent to which convenience had overtaken childhood nutrition, and the series also featured one of the most toe-curlingly awkward scenes ever to grace television screens. Oliver decided to show primary school children what actually goes into chicken nuggets. Some of the processed foods that you love are made from the bits you don't like, he told them, before blending a chicken carcass. He clearly thought that he knew how this was all going to play out. After smushing the weird meat into a paste through a sieve, Oliver added a load of flavourings and stabilisers, shaped it into nuggets, and cooked it. Watching this as an adult, his point is proven. It's horrible, but I think we can all guess what the kids did. When he asked who would still eat this, every single hand went up. And that's why you should never work with an audience as violently unpredictable as young children. This was just one of the many difficult scenes in the series, but it did also uncover some shocking truths. At one point, a South London doctor described seeing children so badly constipated from their poor diets that they'd begun vomiting up feces. It also transpired that the budget for an army's dog's meals exceeded that of a school child's. By the time Jamie's school dinners were done, he still hadn't convinced all of the kids, but many of the country's adults were definitely demanding changes. School meals had become a national embarrassment. In an article for The Guardian, writers Felicity Lawrence and Helen Pidd said the series had touched a national nerve because when he says we are feeding our children scrotum burger shite and making them ill, we know it's true. All of these awkward facts couldn't be ignored, so after the programme aired, a wider campaign was launched called Feed Me Better. Over 270,000 people signed its petition for increased funding and healthier school meals. Cameras captured a smiling Oliver delivering it in person to Dan Downing Street. And it worked. The government, led by Prime Minister Tony Blair, pledged £280 million to overhaul the school lunch system. Jamie's School Dinners picked up 2 BAFTAs, and Oliver won a Channel 4 award for being the most inspiring political figure of 2006. In doing so, he toppled nominees like Bob Geldof, George Galloway, and even, ironically, Tony Blair. For Jamie Oliver, the school dinner scandal had propelled him to new heights. But what was the actual impact of all that fresh funding in schools? Well, despite pledging an enormous pot of cash, the government was slow to make changes. In 2005, a school meals review panel was created to advise on new standards. The Department for Education and Skills also set up a school food trust to help with any reforms, greasing the wheels with a £15 million grant. Experts were now brought in to come up with new nutritional base levels. These were then sent out for wider consultation. In short, as you'd expect, there was a slew of paperwork and discussion. But finally, there were changes that children could see and even eat. A new set of regulations came into force with tighter restrictions. Where before, healthy items only had to be available, now they had to be offered to children in set quantities and frequencies. In essence, the new regime took certain choices away. It's not rocket science to say that most primary school-aged kids are likely going to choose chips over most other things, so rather than being one option, healthier choices needed to become the only option. On top of this, some of the worst offenders, like confectionery, crisps, and soft drinks, were banned altogether. This eliminated the Wild West of the good old school tuck shop, which was previously completely unregulated. Probably to avoid full-scale school riots, these changes were phased in over 3 years. School lunches were reformed first, followed by things like snacks and breakfast clubs. Secondary schools came later in 2009. Government money was channeled into new kitchen facilities and chef training. Jamie's School Dinners was out to improve standards, but the show certainly didn't please everyone. After it aired, the negative chatter around school meals led to a major drop in children eating them. Disillusioned parents were voting with their feet. Caterers complained that the Jamie effect had seen 400,000 fewer children eating school dinners across the UK. This sent a sizable ripple down the river. With smaller numbers ordering cooked meals, kitchens couldn't meet their staff costs and overheads. In some areas, a hot food service was abandoned. Children entitled to free school meals were instead being given sandwiches. In just one council area, Swindon, more than 60 primary schools stopped serving hot food. But proving that you can't please all the people all the time, not everyone was on board even after the school menu shake-up. In September 2006, after healthy standards had been introduced, the BBC reported that parents in South Yorkshire were smuggling their children illicit lunches, things like fish and chips, through the school gates. They pinned this bizarre behaviour on the argument that the school had introduced healthier meals and shortened lunchtime breaks. This meant that students couldn't go off-site, effectively keeping them within the school, where meals could be more tightly controlled. The school said the change was working, food quality was higher, and children had more concentration during the afternoon. Obviously, some parents didn't agree. One mum argued, "They prefer to come to us and have their food delivered fresh and hot. We're giving them what they're asking for." And then there were the packed lunches. For the many parents who had initially abandoned school meals for being too unhealthy and then abandoned them later for being too healthy, the only alternative left was now to provide the child with lunch themselves. Not through the school gates, but packed into lunch boxes. And this came with its own wave of criticism. Speaking to one journalist, Jamie Oliver described home lunches as the biggest evil. Even the best packed lunch, he said, is a packed lunch. He described seeing children with packed lunches consisting of last night's chips or crisps and chocolate bars. Many included fizzy or sugary drinks, which contained high levels of the cancer-causing benzene. These feel like extreme examples, but even the humble homemade sarnie came under fire, because when a sandwich is made with white bread, they are usually high in sugar and salt. The packet of crisps that's often paired with it contains high levels of unsaturated fats and more salts. Better suggestions, courtesy of Jamie himself, were mini chicken salad pitas or wholemeal sandwiches, fruit, yogurts, nuts and seeds. The problem was, of course, that this just wasn't filtering through to the lunchboxes of people's children. Perhaps this evidence of parental failing gave the schools a boost, making them feel that they weren't alone. Post-regulations, they finally held the moral high ground. Their food was now better. In some areas, the response was a strict policing of home-packed lunch boxes, and eventually, some schools banned packed lunches altogether, choosing to instead provide free school meals for every student. They argued that only 1% of packed lunches were healthy enough. In 2007, Ofsted inspectors went into schools to judge the success of changes made, and the results were mixed. Schools were meeting the requirements, yes, but in some areas, pupil uptake had dipped. Inspectors commented that healthier school meals simply hadn't been marketed in the right way to parents and children. It wasn't good enough to just change everything up without preparing the ground first. John Dunford, General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, said that, quote, "You have to persuade children that the school food is cool to eat. Children are conservative and need convincing." Where schools got families involved with activities like helping to design the menus, the results were actually much better, but overall, there were some worrying conclusions. These included criticisms that in 3 out of 5 schools, younger students couldn't use a knife and fork. In one school, pupils were found to be snacking on fizzy drinks and sweets on their morning journey into school. In another, a student described becoming fit by taking regular lunchtime walks to the chip shop. Instant detention for that particular wind-up merchant. The rollout in schools was bumpy, but many food producers weren't thrilled either. One of the household names to fall hardest was Bernard Matthews. The brand's turkey Twizzler, which I, through rosy-eyed glasses, mentioned dreamily earlier, became emblematic of the issues in Jamie's school dinners. Highly processed, low in meat, and bulked up with fat, sugar and additives, the Twizzler was the fast food target. Soon after the series ended, school caterers cut it from their menus, but the brand's managing director, David Joel, said that it was unfairly treated. He argued that a Twizzler has much less fat than a sausage, yet we don't hear Jamie Oliver telling people not to eat sausages. In the immediate aftermath of the programme, Bernard Matthews held firm against the backlash, saying that it had no plans to stop making the product. But sure enough, the Twizzler slipped quietly off shelves. Another one bites the dust. School dinners were once again, briefly, the fresh target of national outrage after COVID hit in 2020. Under normal circumstances, schools wouldn't have to provide free meals for children not actually in school, but as schools were forced to close, or students fell ill and had to isolate, caterers found themselves in new territory. Hot off the press government guidance stated that where pupils eligible for benefits-related free school meals are self-isolating at home, schools should work with their school catering team or food provider to provide good quality lunch parcels. The phrase good quality would come back to haunt them. According to that same guidance, lunch parcels could contain food items rather than pre-prepared meals, essentially giving parents the ingredients they needed to make a lunch themselves. The benefit of this scheme, they said, was the ability to provide a nutritious and varied range of food so that students could eat well while they were off. Clearly, I'm leading to a big finale here because actually, as parents unwrapped their high-quality food parcels, many experienced what one mum described as a sense of sadness. As I unpacked that food parcel and looked at the contents, it felt very sad and depressing. The food parcels fell flat. Her tweet, which was shared thousands of times, featured a photograph of those contents, which included 2 carrots, 2 potatoes, a tin of baked beans, 1 tomato, and a bag of pasta. Marcus Rashford, who was a key player in the Free School Meals campaign, was not happy. And after the footballer started sharing pictures of the meals on his social media, more and more parents began contributing theirs. Some provisions were meagre, but others were just strange. Parents in London described being given flour with instructions on how to bake 8 bread rolls. The whole thing became a fiasco, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson branding the meals as a scandal and a disgrace. As COVID restrictions eased, the issue died down, but it was just one more blow to the national image of school lunches. In 2005, Tony Blair said, "It may take a little time to change children's tastes, but it will be worth the effort if we can get them enjoying healthy and good quality food at school." Shaking up the school meals system was never going to be a smooth or speedy process. So, 20 years down the line, where are we now? Our current school food regulations were published back in 2014. These set the standard for all local authority schools and academies. The government has admitted that 2006 standards were complicated and expensive to enforce. So these days, things are designed to be simpler. Schools can even download a checklist to be sure they're meeting the rules for each food group. According to these rules, children in school today should be eating at least 1 portion of both fruit and vegetables and at least 1 source of protein like meat, fish, eggs or beans every day. Menus must include a portion of milk and dairy, fresh drinking water, and at least 1 type of starchy food. Sweets and chocolates are out. Fish and chips are also sort of out, at least. Deep-fried, battered, and breaded foods can't be served more than twice a week. And if you want a snack, your options are limited to nuts, seeds, fruit, and vegetables. Today, Jamie Oliver's focus has shifted away from in-school meals and onto food education. In 2008, he launched his Ministry of Food with the aim of making healthy eating a key part of earlier life. By teaching children to cook, he says, they'll no longer be dependent on others to feed them. To support this, in 2012, he also kicked off a kitchen gardening project to get primary school children growing and cooking their own food. These days, parents who pay for school lunches will be charged between £2.60 and £5 for each meal. On average, the ingredients cost around £1.10, which is an improvement on the famous 31p figure. But as food prices have risen for everyone, there's a worry that school meals are again feeling the pinch. A survey of caterers carried out in 2023 found that to combat rising costs, 27% were increasing their use of processed foods. Almost 20% said that this affected their ability to meet school food standards. So with costs and prices at odds, will we all end up falling into the same slump as before? When we consider that children allocate around 40% of their time and 30% of their diets to school, it's a big concern. There's no doubt that in the decades they've been around, school dinners have become a strange part of British society's shared history. For older viewers, they're almost a rite of passage, something proudly survived. But it's interesting to wonder what younger generations will make of them later on. It's easy to poke fun at school meals, but they do matter. Food and health are tricky, heated topics, and perhaps that's why voices like Jamie Oliver's still get so many people talking, for better or for worse. In June 2025, Labour's Minister for Early Education announced that the government is acting quickly with experts to revise the school food standards again. More families will soon be entitled to free school meals, and in the next year, the government is also rolling out more free breakfast club places, giving an increased number of children an in-school breakfast before classes start. This has had a mixed reception from school heads, but as a key part of Labour's manifesto, it's something they seem to be digging in on. And I would like to add that as an ex-teacher, I think that breakfast clubs are a great idea, as one of the most disruptive things you can have in a classroom is a child who hasn't eaten. Anyway, in any case, all this means that once again, the system is all change. We can only wait and see what those changes bring. But for now, thank you for watching, and if, like me, you miss those turkey twizzlers, do let me know so I'm not alone.